Hi there, Darren Lutchney here from 365 Assist. Recently I was given a requirement to be able to create a button where the user presses a button in a model-driven app, a Dataverse of course, Power App, that launches a Power Automate flow. Sounds easy. One of the tricks I had to do was I had to grab the user ID, I had to grab the record that they were using at the time and take that to the flow. Also, this whole solution had to be sent with application lifecycle management from a solution to a managed solution in a test and production environment. So I couldn't hard code where the Power Automate flow URL was. So I had to use things like environment variables. Anyway, it sounds easy from a user perspective. From a technical perspective, it's a little tricky. Had to use a bit of JavaScript, but don't let that frighten you. Let's get straight into the video and I'll show you all the components that made up this wonderful mix of a great solution. So from a user perspective and functionality, this is pretty simple from a user point of view. What I've got here is obviously a model-driven app, just a list of from the accounts tab, which is a list of accounts. And if I select on one of those accounts, what I've done is I've added a new button here, customize button on the command bar. In this one I've called Run Flow, and it's going to go away when I click on it and run the Power Automate flow. So I click on that. I've actually even got a pop-up to say that the flow is running, and you'll receive a message in your email when it's complete. Just click OK. And if I go to the flow here and I just refresh what's done, you can see here 12 seconds ago is when I clicked it. It ran off successfully and did what it needed to do, and I'll go through that in a sec about how that triggers. Now I know that the other way I could have done this is just use the flow option up here. There's a problem from my requirements point of view, from what my customer wanted. There was a problem here in that they said, look, it's a bit funny going over to this flow button, then going down here, trying to find the flow I needed and running from that. Why can't I just have a button at the top that just runs it? Which is a good question, and this is how I had to do it. So when I run that one's okay. It goes off and runs another flow with a different trigger. Again, when I click on that, I get this funny, strange sort of pop-up. Again, I have to click. You can also say that the flow uses the Dataverse legacy trigger. I don't know what's going to happen with that, but yeah, it's a bit old-fashioned. And then I've got to run the flow. So the UX isn't very good. You know, I need to run the flow, and then it just says done and like that. So the UX point of view, from a UX point of view, it's not quite as neat as just having the button I had up here to be able to do this. But to do this, I had to use a different trigger. I had to use, so the standard one that I just ran before with the menu, it has a trigger of the legacy trigger of when a record is selected, but the trigger that I had to set up here was an HTTP, when an HTTP request is received. So first bit is to show you how the flow is created, or more importantly, the trigger. The trigger is the most important part of this. The flow itself, this isn't what this whole video is about. So I just want to show you the trigger that runs after the button is created. So it's when HTTP request is received. That's the trigger that we want to use. Just click on that. When you do it for the first time, you get nothing in there. So how do you get all this information in there? Well, it's pretty easy. What we'll do is I'll just switch across to a new one. So it's just going to be an instant trigger when an HTTP request is received. As you can see, there's nothing in there. The first thing I do is just add a sample payload, and the sample payload, it's just getting two fields. That's all I want to do from the app. At the moment, I'm just putting, I need username and account ID. They're the two I want, the current user and the record, the account ID record that the user selected. I'm just putting dummy X's and Y's in there at this stage. It's really not important what goes in there because I'm only using it for the sample payload. So if I go back to here and I put it in the payload and I hit done, it brings out the JSON schema. And once I save this for the first time, I'll get the URL. So let's go back to the other one, and you can see here that's the same thing, and the URL which I'm going to use in my JavaScript That's up the top here. That's the URL. So really, from a flow point of view, that's all I really need to get is the username and account ID. From my point of view, the rest is just flow stuff I've created to go and look for the accounts and send an email to the user with the account name. So the rest is not important in this one. You can build whatever you want, and you can get whatever fields you want to collect as well. So before you start building out the JavaScript, it's probably best to test that the trigger works fine, and you do that. I do that using Postman. It's quite easy to do. The way I did that was just first of all, I copy the URL from here, and then in Postman I just paste it into the post. Make sure you got a post action here. Post it into that, and then you would copy that sample that sample JSON script that you had before. Make sure you got a JSON under raw here, under JSON, and post here. Instead of having X's and Y's, make sure you've got a real username, a real account ID, which is the record in my case is the record of the account, and you hit send. And a couple of things, if it works, you'll get, in my sample, you get nothing here, but what will happen is it will trigger the flow. So if we go back to the flow, and we run it here and we open this flow up, we should see that, there we go, 13 seconds ago the flow ran successfully. So you know here, and then if I open it and I open the trigger, we should see the variables. There we go, they're the variables that I've put in there as well. So that's great. We know that the flow and the trigger works fantastic, and then again you can just run through the rest of it yourself. The next piece we need to do here is create the environment variable where the URL for the flow is going to sit. So remember that when we migrate this solution to another environment, that being test or production using a managed solution, we're going to need to use environment variables. You can't change the variable hard-coded in the app. So we're going to need to use that. So in the solution that you've created, I'm in my development environment. I'm going to have created a new environment variable. Just called it my flows URL. So if we open that, it's pretty simple here. All I've done in this case, I've used the default value, and that's where I've pasted the URL into that. So it's just sitting in an environment variable, and when you get to the other environment, you can go under default, the default solution, and you can go in there and change the environment variable. And in my case, I've set it so it's the default value. You can actually change that in any other environment once you've migrated across. Now we get to quite the tricky part. It's building the JavaScript. I am by no means a JavaScript programmer. I know very little about it, and this is the bit that's caused me a lot of angst. There's a lot on the internet that explains how to do the components that I use to make this up, but it took me a little while. So I'll just go through some of the main things in this. So I use Notepad++ because I like the way it formats it. But I'm just going to go through this sample and explain some of the tricky points. If you've never used JavaScript before, I suggest you start a lot smaller than what I'm showing here. There are some components in here that get quite tricky of how to do, but I'll do my best to explain what I've got here. So I've got a function called launchFlow that we're going to call later. We call in the app later. I just use a variable to bring it in called form context. Again, I probably pinched these words from people on the internet. So the first thing I do is a lot of variable creation. So I create stuff with variables. So the first one is this ID, which is this record ID. Using this, and I can't explain what this whole purple line of code does by any means, but I know it gets the record ID, the Dataverse record ID for the account that it calls. So I just copy that, and that does that variable. I do a lot of these console log. This is good for debugging purposes when you go into the browser and use the console. I'll show you later. You can use a lot of this debugging stuff to see where there are errors. The next one I do is get the current user. Again, I don't understand all of this, but it gets the current username, and I'll create a variable to use later to get that. You also need to do this my headers. When you're using the trigger of the Power Automate, it's going to need some headers, and these are the ones it uses. So again, I've just taken this out of the box. Those sort of three things I've taken, the three things above. The next one I've done, the next variable that I created is creating you have to create JSON for the two variables of being the username and the account ID. So the username obviously is referring to this username variable up here, and this ID is of course referencing this ID. And I found you need to stringify it into a JSON so it works when we're going to use it later to call the flow. So bringing those two together in a JSON string so that can be used. Again, there's a console log so I can see it later. Then I've created a variable called request options, which sort of brings everything together, right? So the method I'm going to do is I'm going to use post. That's what's needed to use the trigger. The trigger needs to post. Not a get, but a post. I'm bringing the headers in, and I'm bringing this raw in, which is this combination of here. Now, I'm sure we could do this a lot smoother and a lot smarter. I did this in a lot of breakup parts. You could probably, if you know enough about JavaScript, you could make it a nice, a better way of doing it. But that's sort of, in my eyes, that's the way I like to work. And then bring down here, I have another console log. Now this is where the actual calling happens. This is where the work actually happens. This line here, there's a function called retrieve multiple records, and it retrieves records from the Dataverse. So you can call a table and get the records from it. The table I'm calling is a standard table called environment variable definitions, and I'll show you what that is. So I'm here in the Dataverse and I'm looking at all tables in my environment, and that particular table, it's a standard table called environment. Let me find it down here somewhere under E, obviously, variable definitions, right? So it's a standard table. So if I open that up to have a look at the records that are in there, you'll see it's pretty easy. What I'm doing is I'm running a filter to call the records here. So I'm running a filter, going to my JavaScript. What this says is go and get the default value column. I want the column called default value, and I want to filter these records based on where the record is called new flows URL. And remember, that's the name of the record that I want from the variable. That's the name of my variable. So I go back to the Dataverse. You can see here, there's the schema name, and that's what I'm filtering on. Sorry, I'm filtering on schema name, and I'm actually after this default value. This is the this default value is the one that that's the URL that I'm going to run that's going to trigger the Power Automate flow. So I need that whole record there, or I need the schema name and the value from that. So what I'm doing here is getting that record where that filter is. There's all sorts of bits and pieces in here. I'm not going to go over all the bits and pieces, but what I'm getting from is the default value, which is I've turned it into another variable called flow URL, and the flow URL is what I'm needing to get to trigger off that automation. So there's some steps in there that I've taken from places, and again, I don't understand all of it, but there's some capturing of errors, etc. If there's an error, capture it and give me some errors on the console log. And then just down here at the bottom here, there's just a pop-up box, that little pop-up box you saw at the end there that says your flow is running, and you can click OK. That's all that bottom bit does. So the next piece is joining all this together, or more importantly, creating the button that's going to link to the JavaScript, and the JavaScript's going to call the flow. But let's link the button now. We've now had the JavaScript, and it's now linked that JavaScript to a button that I'm creating in the app. So I'm in here in my model-driven app. Okay, we just want to edit this app here. So I'll give this a new tab. And it comes up with the pages that I want. I've only got one page in this one. I've just got to find the page that I want. And I'm going to edit the command bar. Now, the first command bar is for the list, if you want to run the button. In our case, we don't, but in the list of all the different records you have, we want to do it in the main form of the accounts. So I'm going to do it in there, and I click Edit. And what you do is you can create a new button here, a new command. Okay, I've already done that, so just new command I've created here. So this is it here, called the run flow. If you look over here, the label's called run flow. I've used one of the flow icon. I'm running a JavaScript. You can run formula, the PowerFX formula, but it won't let you do. At this stage, the PowerFX formula won't let you run a Power Automate script from here. I'm sure that will come. So we have to run a JavaScript. We have to add the the launch flow as the function, which is this thing up here. It's called the top here. Sorry, it's called launch flow. So that has to be called here, and I use a parameter of primary control, so it's got that parameter. But the trick is here is you go to the edit button, find the JavaScript, choose the file, and find the JavaScript that you've created, and just load that in, and then save and publish it. And then once you save and publish it, as I've shown before, it will just run. So just yeah, as I said, if I open up the record and I go into run flow, there we go. Okay, now that's good. Now what we want to do is test it. So the challenge with testing is sometimes the first time I did this, the first few times I did it, it did nothing. I pressed the button, nothing happened. I had no idea what was going on. So you need to use your browser console. Now I use Edge. I'm sure you can do exactly the same thing in Chrome or some of the other browsers. But let me just show you what I did in Edge. I press F12 to go to the developer. So here I'm in the developer console here. And then what I'm going to do is stay in the console. With the button up here, I'm just going to clear the console out just so it's clean and I can see anything in it. Remember all those in these. In the JavaScript, I've got that console.log. I've got a lot of those. So every time that happens, and every time it hits one of those, it's going to log in this console here the variables that I've caught. So I'll hit the run flow, all being well. There you go. There's the variables. So it's got the ID that I caught, the name. This is the account or account ID. This is the name of the user. A combination of those. So as I've done those captures, I can see here. So if you have some problems with these, they're wrong or they don't appear, what I would suggest you do is go back to your JavaScript and start just remarking out areas or records, and remark most of it out until you find, and then rerun it with those areas marked out. So, if I'm having a trouble with this first one, I might just remark these out. It'll, so I can see other pieces of code that are working. I actually probably start at the bottom rather than the top that I've just done, but that sort of helps with that decoding of stuff. There's a nice document online that you can use to help you decode as well. So this document from Microsoft, if you're using Edge, explains how to start debugging in JavaScript. So that's quite a good resource to use when you're debugging. So in summary, take your time. It will take you a lot of time to do sometimes if you're not don't understand all the components and all the JavaScript, so leave yourself plenty of time. There is plenty on the internet if you know how to search for it, for the different components of how to use this and the JavaScript. It's just a matter of bringing it together. I've got a document of exactly what I just said here. This is my article that explains that, so you can go to that. Otherwise, good luck, and I wish you the best.